Hi, I'm Edwina Shaw and this is Kerstin Pilz, and we're coming to you from Arts Nexus on Madangi country. We'd like to pay our respects to the people of this land, especially their storytellers. So we're here today to talk about writing for healing. So my name is Edwina, I'm a Brisbane-based writer. I write fiction, memoir and screenplays, and I've been writing since 2002, and writing and publishing and teaching writing since 2005. I'm also a yogi teacher. Yeah.
Thank you. And my name is Kerstin Pilz. If you're wondering about my accent, I was born and raised in Germany, and I now live in Mission Beach, far north Queensland. And for many years, I was an academic, and I wrote in an academic voice, but I've always wanted to be a writer of other types of books. So I'm finally at this stage in my life fulfilling that passion, and I'm writing a memoir at the moment.
Yes, and I'm about to edit it, so that's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to reading it. So how did you start this journey to writing for healing, Kerstin?
Yeah, so mine started, as it so often does, with a difficult life event. And it was actually a succession of difficult life events. And I was living in this remote area and I didn't have access to a counselor. So I made my notebook, a little moleskin, and pen and paper became my therapist. And it was incredible to have this little tool in my pocket available to me 24/7. And so the first journey into writing to heal was quite, I guess it followed on from having written a journal as a teenager, going through that sort of heartbreaking time of finding yourself as an adult. And I realized how healing it is to actually write your pain on the page and to just let it go.
Yes, so I started journaling too, of course, in my teens, but I've kept journaling the whole way through. Did you have a period where you stopped there?
Yeah, I did. I did continue writing. My problem, I guess, mainly was that I shifted languages. So when I first came to Australia, I actually had this burning passion to become a journalist. And I was discouraged because my English was high school English, and I had never been to an English-speaking country before. I was 25 at the time. And so I was discouraged. So I chose a different career in Italian studies. Oddly enough, I ended up writing and publishing in that language. So the journaling, I would pick it up whenever things were difficult. Like I was sometimes as a hobby to counterbalance the academic writing. I was playing around in my journal with sort of fictional stories, but then telling myself, you're not good at that. So it was sporadic more than a practice, an ongoing practice. Yeah. What about you, Edwina?
I think I've always used my journal, and I would recommend it to anybody who is wanting to write for healing. Journaling is the first place to start. And for all writers, actually, journals are how we do our practice. Dancers do their warm-ups, artists do sketches, and we write journals. So it's very important. And the daily releasing of crap helps you just... get rid of it's a form of meditation, really.
Yes.
As long as you're recording more than went to the shops and saw Nancy. Yeah.
Yes, and I think we both actually used the artist's way as a way to nurture that practice. So the artist's way, Julia Cameron actually wrote that book, working in the Hollywood film industry, helping creatives getting unblocked. And her advice is very simple: write by hand, 3 pages in the morning, first thing before you do anything else. Maybe have a cup of coffee or meditate.
Take your coffee with you.
Yes, and that is really helpful. Yes.
Yes. So are you still doing that?
Yeah, well, at the moment, because I'm writing and was very frantically finishing the memoir, the third draft, the draft that I want to show to you, I have stopped all that kind of writing, but I think I'll go back to it as soon as that memoir.
Oh, I'm totally hooked. I read that book in 2002 and I've done it every day, 3 pages. Sometimes the pages are a bit shorter, but that's all. They're just a bit shorter. But yeah, they're very useful and certainly a great way to use writing for healing. So how did you, apart from journaling, what then happened?
Well, for me, I did actually want to then become a travel writer. And so I did actually write a number of, I was sort of moderately successful, let's say, as a travel writer. And then I did have this difficult life event happen. I got married at 43, I think, and then by 45, I was married to a terminally ill, serially unfaithful husband. And 3 weeks after the funeral, we had a Category 5 cyclone that destroyed my community, and suddenly everybody was grieving. And I think it was the urgency for me to write about grief that really made me continue to write. It was for one reason was to release my own feelings, to come, to terms with the anger and the pain. But at the same time, I felt there was a real stigmatizing in our Western society to move through grief really quickly. And I would get people saying, well, it's been 5 months now. Shouldn't you be a little bit, better? Shouldn't you be on the upswing? Shouldn't you be over it? And I realized there's really this sort of taboo subject. You can't talk about death and you can't talk about grief. And I felt I wanted to actually write that story to share this universal message that you don't get over grief, you get through it, and you need to lean into it in order to really process. And writing is the best way, I found, to do it, along with yoga, of course. So, and that is where we intersect. We both use yoga, and we've both written about grief. So perhaps tell us about your...
So I'll just do the grief book now. So this is the book that I've written on grief. I wrote it after the death of my son when I was 40. But grief has been a big shaping force in my life, which I think maybe is why I had to start writing, though I always wanted to write as a child as well. But my father died when I was 14 from terminal cancer, which was very ugly. And then my brother developed schizophrenia and killed himself at 21. So by the time I was in my mid-30s, which is when I had small children, I was only working part-time, and I had windows of opportunity for writing, and I did The Artist's Way and remembered my childhood dream of writing, and the first stories that I had to tell were the ones that I couldn't get out of my head. So I'd watched this in other people. In the mid-90s, I'd worked in Cambodia with the victims of the Pol Pot regime, well, the survivors of the Pol Pot regime, who were gorgeous people. You've never met more beautiful people. But as soon as they had the words in English, all they wanted to tell me was their story of survival. And then I came home, and when the children were young, I was working with migrants and refugees, teaching English again. And again, I saw the same thing happening. They just needed to first of all, tell me their stories of what had happened to them. And I found that myself. And I think it's those stories that are in our heads that replay and cause us distress. And so I started writing those stories because they were the ones on the top of my head that were just burning to come out in my book Thrill Seekers, which I haven't got a copy of today. But so I got into a Masters of Creative Writing at the University of Queensland and developed Thrill Seekers through that. But they were really all the stories of my brother's schizophrenia and what that was like living with a sibling with a serious mental illness. But I fictionalised it.
Yeah, so that was going to be my question. So you fictionalised it. Why did you do that, and what did that do to the story?
Well, I learnt a lot about writing for healing through that process. I mean, it was all straight memoir at the beginning, but then I wanted to protect my family. I wanted to protect my mother, and I had 3 other siblings who had survived Maddie as well, and I wanted to protect them. So, and I changed my own sex. I wanted to protect myself. I didn't want to expose myself as much either, and I would recommend fictionalising for memoirists to avoid a lot of the ethical issues, which we'll discuss later. But the process of fictionalising really helped distance me from the story, and it gave me the power to change things, in particular the ending. So in real life, my brother killed himself at 20, but in the book, he survives and can go on and have adventures and takes off in a boat. In the book, I made myself a male character. I did an early workshop with a writing teacher called Mark Svensson, who got us to do exactly this process: write a piece of straight memoir and then change the sexes, change the settings, and all the other telling details, disguise occupations and so on. And it was really great because all of a sudden I wasn't me. I was a 16-year-old young man. So giving your really hard emotions to this other person, even if it's your memoir character voice, was very empowering. It distances you from it. Though I must say, I cried for 1,000 hours, I would think, writing Thrill Seekers and a lot of the grief book as well, just clearing all the tears that I had never allowed myself to shed and that yoga had brought to the surface.
Yes. And so, writing to heal is really also not writing from the head, but writing from the heart, writing from the body. And that's where the yoga can be so helpful. And for example, we both run workshops on writing to heal and also creative writing workshops, of course, and memoir writing workshops. And we both use yoga and meditation as a way of getting into that stillness, getting into the body, and then finding the words, the story, and the voice to tell the stories. And there's a famous quote by Maya Angelou, there's nothing worse than holding an untold story. And that's what we want to get to, those untold stories, and to find different ways of telling them. Like you said, finding writing them as fiction, which is how I started. I actually I gave myself as my 50th birthday present an online course in creative writing, but it was fiction. So I wrote this first draft of a story that will never see the light of day, but it was incredibly healing because I suddenly made up these characters who were not me. They had red hair, they had freckles. I made one character an arms dealer in Nigeria.
Let's spice things up.
And it was extremely, like you said, cathartic to just watch these characters walk away with my intense feelings, and that was so helpful. But I realized also I actually wanted to write it as a memoir because I felt it was more authentic and powerful, possibly, to write it as an I narrator. And however, then I did a detour because I still had that imposter syndrome somewhere in the back of my mind. You can't be a writer. So what I did is for 5 years I taught writing to heal. I moved to Vietnam, and in Hoi An I had the Hoi An Writers Group, and I brought together these mainly women, but we also had some men. And it was wonderful to do. But then I can say the silver lining of the pandemic was that I became stuck in Australia. The borders closed. I couldn't go back to Vietnam. I was there with my box of journals. I said, right, get down to work and write that memoir. And so that's what I did.
And just finished.
And just
First
finished.
draft.
Well, the draft.
Yeah. So the second book I wrote was based on my time living and working in Cambodia. And what really drew me to Cambodia was I was in Australia. I'd lost my father and my brother, a third of my family, in traumatic circumstances, but nobody around me that I knew had been undergoing this. Whereas when I got to Cambodia, everybody was in the same boat. So that book, for me, again, fiction, serial chicken, it was looking at, is it worse to suffer in a group where everybody is grieving or to suffer alone? And what I really reckon it's worse when everybody's suffering, because then the whole country needs to recover, and it takes a lot longer. You have a much better hope of recovering if your community is healthy. So, and from there then I lost my son, and that spurred the writing of the grief book, which has sat in my computer. So it's a mix of memoir, so it's talking about my father's death, my brother's death, my son's deaths, but it's also very practical. I wanted to give practical advice. It's the book that I wish somebody had given me when I was 14 and lost my dad, with the tools I really, really needed when I was 21, instead of just turning to even more drugs and alcohol. But I had those tools by the time I was 40. So I'm sharing all of those tools. So it's a mix of yoga, exercises, visualizations, recipes, because I love cooking, and chicken soup. You always need chicken soup, and creative activities, including lots and lots of writing activities, because I had found them so useful, as well as art activities. I really believe that our creative impulse is there to help us express emotion, and including, and most importantly, our grief and loss and sadness and anger.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like, expressing your grief and anger on the page and writing it, trying to write it as a scene, trying to write it with characters in mind, and, experimenting with storytelling is really powerful, and it actually helps you to find your voice and to find sort of legitimacy. It is okay to tell that story. It's not a story I have to hide away, because I felt, and that was interesting how you drew the conclusion that grieving on your own may be more useful than grieving as a group. And I did have a similar experience where my community was suddenly grieving in the aftermath of Cyclone Yasi, which was referred to as the largest, most devastating category in Australia's living memory. And suddenly an entire community was grieving, and people would come to my house and say, "Why are you so upset? You didn't actually lose the roof." I'm going, "Yeah, but I did lose my husband 3 weeks ago. Don't you remember?" "Oh, yes, I totally forgot." So for me, it was actually much more helpful to then remove myself from that devastated, grieving community, also because the landscape really looked like a mirror of my internal landscape, and I just could not look at the fallen trees and the denuded, branches, the destruction. So I went traveling, and somebody said, "Go to Bali, go to a health spa," and I said, "No, I need something more hardcore." So I went to Sri Lanka, and I somehow ended up there simply by coincidence. However, the first thing I did is I went to the Tsunami Museum, and I saw all the very graphic and vivid expressions and ways of healing and keeping alive the memory of the trauma of the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 that killed, I can't remember the figure now, but many thousands of people. And here I am, I actually brought my Cyclone special with me, because I thought, that way I can show people what I've just been through. And they say, "Well, how many people died?" And I went, "Well, in Australia, we're so well prepared in a natural disaster. One person died." And so it was really useful for me to actually put that grief into perspective and to be around other people who were grieving, even though we didn't speak the same language, we didn't have the same experience, but just to feel it's okay to not hold on to the grief, but it's healthy to experience the full range of emotions, rather than like my family expected of me to armor up, soldier through. You've always been strong, you got this, just start working again, it'll pass. No, it doesn't. It'll fester. And so that's where I think those kinds of books, I did think perhaps of writing my book like yours in a self-help style, but in the end I sort of fell in love with the idea of storytelling. So let's see if it works.
Yes, I mean, it's the crafting of that story that really brings a lot of healing. And for me, with Thrill Seekers, I really wanted to create a work of beauty from the pain, so that some good came of it. Otherwise, I suppose it's about creating meaning. So I've worked a lot with, especially over the last 15 years and in particular the last 7, working with people who have suffered severe trauma, such as the Forgotten Australians who are in institutions, but other people too through my retreats. And often people will come and the first attempt will be like a myth or some type of a fairy tale. They will tell that very, very disguised, mythologized version, which has a great role. But I've found that the greatest healing comes from, as you were saying, writing in scenes, using those specific sensory details, really putting yourself back there. So it's like in meditation, seeing it, feeling it, and letting yourself feel it and express it. Usually that means getting snotty and crying and ugly, but that's it. That's how we heal, is crying and making ourselves snotty and ugly. But then another layer is gone. And I will still cry now when reading bits of Thrill Seekers aloud. I try and not pick bits that are sensitive, but all of a sudden it'll hit me. And I'm still, my brother has been dead 35 years now. My father has been dead over 40, so 42. So as long as he was alive, he's been dead now. And I still grieve them. I still talk to them. But the pain of those traumatic memories is gone. Mm-hmm. And that's been the great healing power of writing, rewriting, shaping it into a work of art. Mm-hmm. So when you're writing for yourself, yes, just write it all, just get it all out, get it all off your chest. It can be as ugly and as messy and as angry and as vengeful as you need it to be. Mm. But then I think the real healing comes, okay, get that out, cry your heart out, then rewrite it, reshape it. And it's that, have you found that yourself, that making it into a creative work, mm-hmm. that extra hours, the rewriting, that was where, you get so sick of your own story, it's gone.
But you do have to tell it over and over, because part
Yes.
of my healing was to go to these silent meditation retreats and 10 days silence. I did 3 weeks silence. You get out of there and the first thing I wanted to do is chat and tell people my story again. I think it's really interesting, that process, the catharsis, because people often ask me, so was it cathartic now writing that book, writing the memoir, because it's taken you a long time? Well, actually the writing took me since maybe I started maybe 6 months before the pandemic to seriously write it as a memoir, and so it's maybe 2.5 years.
That's pretty quick for a book.
Pretty okay, but I had gone through the material. But I found two things. One, the catharsis really happened when I wrote in those tear-stained diaries that I have in the box. I can't wait for the day to actually have a big bonfire and let them all go. I have met people who say, no, I'm going to hold them all on because it's a record of who I am. But I feel I'm ready to release them now. So the real catharsis was in writing, and some of it I read now and I go, oh my God, that's terrible. But I needed to write it back then, And now when I then sat down and wrote it as a memoir, I then became the protagonist of that book. And something happens when you write your own story as a memoir, because even though it's not fiction, it's from your own story, you become a different person. You look at yourself in a different way, and then you shape. And then you write the first draft, as Stephen King says, with the doors closed, and don't let anybody in, and allow yourself to just write anything. And it doesn't matter if it's bad. Some people refer to it as the vomit draft. And
Yes.
It literally is the vomit draft.
Yes, definitely.
Then the second draft you write with the reader in mind. And that's when that shaping happens. And that's
Yes.
when you go, do they really need to know all that backstory? Is that really boring? Would I read the chapter that starts with all that boring backstory? Probably not. And I found that so fascinating. And I did a lot of study. I even studied Dan Brown, who, as we know, doesn't write memoir, or he's not known for memoir.
But you keep turning the page.
But I keep turning the page, so learning his lessons and then applying them to the memoir. That was actually also really cathartic, because like you said, then suddenly you're shaping that story that has a universal message, because we will all grieve at some point or many points in our lives, but you're shaping that into a story for somebody else to go, it's okay to feel that way. Yes.
Yes.
And that is really, really helpful. And that's where the second catharsis, in a way, happens.
Yes. And I think it's that in memoir, if you're not fictionalising like me and giving it to another character, it's that perspective when you step away from yourself and go, well, I am not the person I was 10 years ago when that was happening. I am now this person. And I think that that's very useful. And I have never been able to write when in the midst of a traumatic situation. It took me, so I was in my mid-30s, 33, before I started writing about my brother's death when I'd been 21, so it was 12 years later, so that I was able to start writing about it. And then with the grief book, and this is the curse of the writer, on the night that my baby, because it was an infant son, he was only 3 days old, on the night that he died, I found myself sitting on the toilet, bleeding, milk filling my breasts, thinking, aha, I've got the title, Blood and Milk. And then I thought, oh my God, Edwina, just turn yourself off. But I think that's indicative too of how much I rely on writing for healing. Oh, I just hit a nerve. Yes, so yes, that the writing has really been an essential tool, and the yoga mat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, and I often sometimes get people and say, "You're writing a memoir, you, as in you're not Michelle Obama, you're not famous. Why would people write your memoir?" And I say, well, it's actually, memoir is about writing a story of universal value, but you're writing it in a way that is really engaging, and you go into those moments when you are, what was it, did you say in the bathroom? And blood and,
blood and milk.
Yes, and you take the reader into that moment and they go, I've been in a similar situation, oh my God. And you allow them to relive that moment and to live with you through that experience of how you healed that.
Yes.
And I actually have to say, my writing just now has become a little bit of an addiction. Like going over the memoir, rather than going to bed or watching Netflix, I'm like, oh, just sneak into that chapter. So it can be a curse, like the famous writer's block, like, oh my God, but it can also turn into something pleasurable, almost addictive, or even addictive.
I think there's a stage in every writer's life when the only book we want to read is the book we're writing.
That's right.
We're so consumed by it. But yes, and that's a great process.
And I was just going to follow on while it's in the forefront of my mind. You said sometimes the only book you want to read is the one you're writing. And for me, when I was going through this difficult time, which felt a bit like, I'm sure anybody, we all go through difficult times in our lives, and you sometimes find yourself standing outside going, is this really happening? Gee, you couldn't make this up, could you? And in that moment, I couldn't read any other books. Like, people would give me books, just distract yourself, read anything, read Dan Brown. I was like, no, Helen Garner's The Spare Room. That's the first book I was really drawn in. I mean, I also like Helen Garner's prose very much, but it was about her getting her spare room ready to help her friend through a treatment for her cancer. And it's like, my situation was very different, but we were still dealing with cancer, and it was like, hearing Helen Garner swear or get upset with her friends, like, yes, as a carer, you have right to do that. And so I read loads of books on grief, on memoirs on people dealing with cancer. And that's why I thought, maybe if I write my story, maybe somebody will one day go, okay, this book has helped me in some form.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I think a lot of writers have an experience in their childhoods or teen years where you will read something and you connect and you've realised for the first time that you are not alone.
Yeah.
And that was a great thing. And that's, I think, always. And Thrill Seekers too is very much about working class boys who never get a voice. There aren't those stories told really, or they're not that I knew. I got sick of Nick Earls, Brisbane, and all the other. I mean, we had Andrew McGann, so we had a slightly rougher version. But I wanted my version of Brisbane to be there too. But it's about that connection, that human sharing, so that we know that we're not alone. And writing is the greatest tool for compassion, isn't it? We get inside somebody else's head.
I was just going to say, and you do that so beautifully about the Brisbane, because I grew up in Germany. And so I felt when I read Thrill Seekers, I was experiencing Brisbane. And I think, gee, what a childhood. How beautiful, floating down that river and so on.
Yes.
But coming back to compassion, before we were chatting about how important it is when you're writing a memoir that you don't write it as a revenge memoir, because
you can put that in.
Yeah.
Do it as fiction, but maybe not in the final draft.
Yes, and then, like you said, having the compassion there. Like, for example, in my case, of course, I was angry with my husband when I found out all the things that he was hiding from me. But I also, obviously I had to have compassion for him because he was also dying. But I felt through the writing, you realize when you're writing it as memoir, my version of the story is my version of the story. His relatives or friends or whoever were also attached to the story would have their version. And so, yes, have that compassion front of mind, leading with the heart, which is why, writing to heal and using yoga and meditation helps you stay connected to the emotion, and then using that compassion to tell the most rounded story that you can tell.
Yes, even I like to do an exercise which is in the shoes of your enemy. It's not very popular, but you have to write a story. So you write first about a teacher who did you wrong, the teacher you hated most, your meanest teacher, and then you have to rewrite the scene from the teacher's perspective. Yeah, so that's
I did
that's
that
fun.
exercise with you in a workship. I loved it.
Yeah. So yeah, it can be a bit sensitive, but but yes, and it's about. I've been working the last several years with forgotten Australians. So these are people who are in institutions from childhood, hard as, and it's by Brian Hart as. So this is Brian's book. Brian is a dear friend of mine who recently died. I sat with him for 5 years because most forgotten Australians don't have literacy skills because they were deprived of education, only trained to be farmhands or housekeepers, and sat with him and recorded his story because this was his burning desire to get his story told, his version told. And that's the point I wanted to make about memoir, that this is a work of memory. That's why it's called memoir. It's not facts.
And he's left his legacy. You said he's passed on now. So he has actually left the legacy of
But his record of what happened, his version of events, which is not perhaps the historical truth, objective truth, which I don't believe there is, because all truth is subjective. This is Brian's truth. And it's very important. But it can lead you into difficulties with the ethics of memoir if other people's versions are significantly different from yours. But there will always be differences. And even fictionalising, because I thought I'll be safe from all that ethics and memoir stuff doing fiction, but those who recognise which bits are memoir and which bits are fiction, they will still be upset. So with Thrill Seekers, I made the mother an alcoholic and sort of working class, and my mum is, she was a history and French teacher and very, very straight classical music, no alcohol, nothing. And so I made it an alcoholic, sort of cleaner mother. And she was not happy, and I had to do a disclaimer at the launch. And one of my sisters, who I love dearly, I wanted to really protect my younger siblings, so I didn't put them in. But then she was really upset because she wasn't in there. So even if you've fictionalised, be prepared if you write from your life that people may be upset.
Yes.
Even if that's the least of your intentions. And keeping that compassion even for the bad guys in your story.
Exactly. Very important. Yeah. Just thinking about people getting upset about not being in the story. So when I was when I was sort of sharing with my friends, I'm going to write this book, and then I thought, they'll probably be upset that they're not in the book. But when you're telling it as a book, as a memoir in my case, and I'm hoping to publish it with a commercial publisher, or then you need to really shape the story so that it makes sense, and you can't have that many characters.
Yes.
So you're actually you're not fictionalizing it, but you are shaping the story so that it fits into the narrative arc, and you're following the conventions of good storytelling. And Dan Brown is a great master at the page turner. And I found shaping the book then, or my story, from the messy journals where I tell myself the same thing over again and so on, into a book that has a coherent story arc, using the hero's journey, really. It helped me also to put my own story in order and to find the, I for a long time I thought, I've wasted so many years being so upset, grieving. No, I didn't. I actually then also found where I grew in the darkness. So the growth happens, and Julia Baird wrote a book recently, Phosphorescence, and she calls it growing by moonlight. And I love that expression because that's what happens often in the dark times. But before we got ready for this interview, we were also talking about, with reference to Hard As, that when you have a dark tale about grief, about death, about a hard traumatic childhood, make sure you also find the lightness and share the moments of joy and humor with the reader. I tried, for example, because mine is about grief, to use moments of self-deprecating humor, and the few people I've showed it to, they say, yeah, good, put your Bridget Jones voice in there. So that does work, and it helps also the author to keep it somehow lighter and to go, well, I'm not writing a pity memoir, I'm not writing a big sob story, or my friends can't say I'm doing self-pity, it's about something else.
Yes.
So maybe you can say.
So when I was writing Thrill Seekers, and I had this fancy pants agent, she sent it off to Penguin, and I had an hour-long conversation with the Penguin editor, and that was something he said to me: we need the light in with the darkness. And I said, but there was no light, it was all dark. But I knew I needed to put some light in the book, so I went looking. And once you go looking, you will find it. There were all those moments of joy out on the boat and out at the dances and the parties and the good times and the love between friends. And the same with Brian. So it's a great tool once you start looking for that joy. But the same with Brian's book. We were looking for the joy. So even though he was in an orphanage where they were scrabbling in the dirt and eating the roots of weeds and whatever they could find because they were starving, and he was beaten every day and called ridiculous and ugly and stupid every day, there were the moments of joy when he went fishing and caught enough to feed all the kids in the orphanage, and he was eating there, and he had a piece of eel and he looked around and he fed everybody. Or the day the army guy came with all the lollies all over him. But it's a great tool for all of us. There's an equal balance of darkness and light in the Taoist philosophy, the yin and yang, and the seed of each is in the other, but it's an equal balance. Too much we look at the dark side. If we keep our focus here, that we'll find more joy. If we start the day thinking, I'm looking for joy today, our day will be more joyful. I'm looking for beauty today, our day will be more beautiful.
Yeah, and that was actually part of my writing practice. When things were really dark, I actually started doing this gratitude practice, which, is quite popular now, but I didn't know at the time that there is actually such a thing. In fact, you can pick up gratitude journals now, and I found that really helpful. 5 things that I was grateful for today, because even on those really dark days, there was always something to be grateful for. There were great moments of joy. In my case, because we live in a remote area here in Far North Queensland and people have gone through natural disasters before, there's a great sense of community. And we had only just moved here and people came together to help me, for example, have him die at home. And people went out of their way to come to the house at 2 a.m. to help me change the patient over, because otherwise the Tully Hospital said we would have to take him back to the hospital. So there was a lot of joy in those moments, and capturing them as part of the story really helped to tell a more rounded story.
Yeah, lovely.
So it was actually Edwina who put the finger on the exact genre, I guess, of memoir I'm writing. And you said to me when I sent you a chapter outline that I was writing a spiritual memoir. And I thought, me writing a spiritual memoir? And when I tell it to a friend, they all roll their eyes, thinking she's really gone off with the fairies now. But actually, a spiritual memoir is really just an investigation of the big questions. And I grew up an atheist. We didn't have religion in the house. I know a lot of people who come to my retreats who may be lapsed Catholics or have been brought up with some religion of sorts. But when you come to these big turning points in life, when something, when death happens and you say, what did it all mean? Why? And so on. I felt it very important to turn to something outside of me. And obviously I read books, but I really felt there needed to be something else. But it wasn't going to be God. We did have an act of God, a natural disaster. So I sort of knew that I wasn't protected on that front. So what really appealed to me was Buddhism, and it was Buddhist meditation, and just sitting in meditation. It just made so much sense to me. So I put myself through this Buddhist program on my own, if you like. And I actually did travel to Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha, the historical Buddha, attained enlightenment. And the Dalai Lama was there for 2 weeks. So I actually attended what's called a color chakra ceremony. Most of it went over my head, but it was sort of important to me to be in the company of other pilgrims, I guess. I really went on a pilgrimage because it also made sense to me that this story was a quest of how to deal with things when things fall apart, how to fall apart gracefully, which is in fact the title of my book. And so Buddhism was a way for me to make sense of things and to find meaning and to let things go and so on. So that is where my, I guess, spiritual component comes into play. What about you, Edwina?
I was brought up Catholic, very Catholic. But I'm now in recovery, as we like to say. But I've always been a spiritual seeker. So when I first went to university, there was no creative writing, so I studied writing, but my other major was religion. So I studied world religions and got a perspective on all of those. I was always searching, so I've looked into Buddhism, Taoism, they're my favourites. Some aspects of Hinduism I like, which is more related to the yoga, but I really like yoga because it's more a philosophy than a religion. And I like the essential Buddhism. I don't like any organised religion, actually. Most of them have been taken over by patriarchal values. So I like women-centred spirituality. But yes, I've had lots of people from many different faiths at my retreats and workshops. And as you were saying, death sent us on that search for meaning and the search for the divine, really, in all of us. So for many years, and that was a thing also in my family's history, the intergenerational trauma was blaming God, a hatred of God. And when things happen, such as the murder of a child, this inexplicable horror, and wars and so on, how can you believe in a God who would allow this to happen? The greatest thing on this point I've ever seen was a documentary about an African community who had moved to rural Australia. And these people had seen horrors. Their mothers and daughters raped and murdered, their children murdered in front of their eyes. And somebody said to them, but how can you believe in a God who would do such a thing? And they said, but God was with us, holding us. That's a way that we can reconcile ourselves to the divine when even very dreadful and traumatic things happen. So the many forgotten Australians I work with very much feel in that way, and for me, I create my own religion that I've made up myself, which is very joy-focused, and it's about, yes, what brings you comfort. Believe what makes you happy and brings you comfort. If you're believing in something that makes you feel uncomfortable and is filled with hatred, then that's not something that's a healthy belief. So, yeah. And it's all about nature, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, with the organised religion, I also don't believe in organised religion, and often traditional Buddhism is also very much a patriarchal and so on, hierarchical lineage. However, what I really liked, the key message I got from the Dalai Lama, because I felt like I really want to become a good Buddhist now. I think that's going to solve all my problems. And he said, not to me individually, but it was actually a book launch at this event, his book, and it was about ethics, a new ethics. And he said, it doesn't matter what religion you believe in. The main thing is you need to continue to work on yourself, because your purpose is to evolve as a human being. And that struck such a deep chord with me, because this whole journey through the darkness was a form of growth, a form of personal interrogation, and that led me to so many unexpected questions and answers. So that is what I treasured from that as well.
Yeah, I love Buddha's essential idea, which is find your own way. Yeah. That's it. Find your own way. And writing can really help you find your own way, and a regular daily practice. It doesn't have to be yoga. It's just coming home to yourself every day, whether it's walking. For me, it's that connection with nature is very important. The yoga practices really work because the movements of the body release the emotion that you stuff down as much as you can. But it works on so many different levels. It keeps you healthy and it keeps you happy.
Yes.
And that spiritual stuff will come. So my tradition is, do your practice and all is coming, and that works for everything in your life.
So in conclusion, the best thing you can do for yourself is do yoga and write, possibly every day. So then I was thinking perhaps we should give our listeners some tips and tools on how to get started. And maybe you could start.
So as I was saying, write the first draft, make it as ugly and full of tears and warts and revenge and anger as you like. But And if you're having trouble even starting with that, I would recommend doing some gentle yoga or a meditation, and not thinking about, I'm going to have to write the whole thing. You don't have to write the whole thing. Thrill Seekers, I just started with this one memory that wouldn't let me go. So just choosing those memories. So I've forgotten the name of the writer now, but she calls them heart-clutching moments. So they're moments of great emotional impact. So just write yourself a list of, well, that was a shitty day, or I remember there was a good day. Remember to put some of the good ones in, or the good moments. So the heart-clutching moments, write a list of them, and you can write to each of those. Another way to start is to use photographs.
Yeah.
So photographs from the time, or perhaps if you're writing a memoir about the family, using an old photo, or get a photo of yourself as a child if you're writing about your own childhood trauma, and remembering that you are no longer that child, you are the grown-up who is here to help that child. Yeah, so writing to photos, using prompts, of course, coming along to either of our retreats is really great, especially the live writing ones. We'll give you lots of prompts and lots of ideas, but don't think about the whole big thing because that's overwhelming. Just little bit by little bit by little bit.
Yes, somebody said to me once, you don't sit down to write your book, you sit down to write a scene, you sit down to write 500 words, whatever your marker is. I did, my first career as a writer was an academic, so I wrote this PhD, which became a book, and that was a long haul. But I had it all mapped out. Writers often write differently. You know, there's the plotsters and the pansters. So those who write by the seat of their pants, and they discover the story as they write. And it's especially popular or helpful with genre fiction. I'm sure Dan Brown sits there and does an outline,
I think that's all he does, and gives it to somebody else.
Maybe. But Stephen King, for example, is totally against outlines.
Yeah.
So there are different ways, but definitely, like Edwina just said, I often with my writers, we start with making lists, and one very popular exercise is I remember, and just write those significant life moments, or even the moments when your life changed before and after. And it doesn't have to be a terrible thing. It can be you got married, you had a child, you finished university, so it can be also those significant moments. And then learn how to write them as a scene. And a scene means you have an event, so something happened, and you want to take the reader into the scene. You want the reader to experience that moment with you. So you're not telling, you're trying to show. And that is where you obviously write also through the senses, you bring it alive, and you take me into your head. This is very important. Oftentimes we don't, we do very objective writing. She got up, she made a cup of tea, and so on. But we want to be also in the head of the narrator.
Well, not too much.
Yeah.
Get them talking.
Get them talking. But I mean, as you do that, what I mean is by have the subjective view, whether it's not just being in the head. I mean,
how is she making that cup of tea? Because how is she feeling in that moment?
And how is she saying, lovely to see you? Is it with her eyes rolling, or is it genuine? That kind of subjectivity I meant,
Yeah, that's right.
And like you said before, go where the fear is, go where the pain is, because those are, and I've seen it, I'm sure Edwina would agree, you see it time and time again. Like you said, people go near a significant moment and then stop themselves and move on. Go where the fear is. Don't worry, that is where the reader wants to go with you, because any book that you would call your favorite book would have had that effect on you, and it would have really taken you into the emotion, and that's what you want to do. However, you might just want to write a diary. You might just want to write your story to get it out of your system without ever wanting to show it to a publisher, and that's fine too.
Yes.
And that's extremely healing as well.
Yes. And so I would always say, go deeper, go deeper.
Yes.
There's always another layer, and especially with those ones that you're really scared of. So I do an exercise like, what stories do you want to write?
Yeah.
What stories do you need to write? And what stories are you scared to write? And they're the ones that actually need to be told. But it may take you a while to get there. It took me a long time. I wrote the grief book the year after my son died, and it actually, the process of writing down about not only my loss at that time, but the activities that helped me at that time. But I only published it a couple of years ago when COVID started, because I thought, it's sitting in my computer. All these people around the world are grieving. I've got something that may help them. But I've forgotten what I was going to say. It is very important to tell your story in a way that's true to you and going deeper into the hard stuff. Otherwise, it's not going to mean anything.
Yes, and when you say go deeper, also that means slow the narration down. Don't be afraid, and that's the beauty of a scene. You're not skipping over it, and then this happened, and then that happened. You're actually taking us into the moment, and you really slow it down, and that is when you can really unpack the story and have that impact on the reader.
Yes.
So maybe we should talk about what we're writing at the moment, because we have discovered many similarities, and we actually happen to be interested in the same thing for our next book, in a very different way, however.
So I feel like I've cleaned out all of my own closets, and so now I'm working on a book. Well, actually, I've got another memoir that's cleaning out another one. But the book that I'm working on now, and I've been working on for about 12 years, is the story of the murder of my nana's sister by a farmhand when she was 10 years old in the Lockyer Valley. West of Brisbane. The sister was 10 years old. My nana was 7. So Nana told me and all my sisters this story when we were 7. So it's been in my head since I was 7, and I think I've been trying to write it ever since then, because I've seen the pattern of grief and how that unresolved trauma stays in the body. So I'm trying to heal that pattern of grief so it does not keep repeating for my children, for my daughter and my son, and to heal my mother, and to perhaps, I don't know whether we can heal people who have gone on, but to bring healing to the whole situation. So it's a combined novel and memoir, reflecting on intergenerational trauma, but also exploring the murderer and finding ways to give forgiveness, to extend forgiveness, even, which I can do from this distance, because it was a great aunt I never met. But when it's your child, imagine how difficult that is. And the wonderful woman Rosie Batty, who was somehow able to go out and advocate for women in similar situations after the brutal murder of her son.
And she wrote a memoir about it?
She wrote a memoir. She started a charity. She was an incredible woman.
Oh, yes. And she became Australian of the Year?
Yes.
I don't remember.
Yes, and extending compassion then. So to find forgiveness, how do we forgive the murder of a child? So I investigated his background and did a lot of research and discovered his own traumatic background, and that he had been put in an orphanage in the 1870s. When he was 4 years old. And after working with people who were in orphanages in the 50s and 60s here, and knowing how horrific and the damage that it did to them then, I can only imagine. So he was created. We create really our own monsters. He had a mental illness as well, but it was all that ongoing trauma that really triggered the disorder that led to the murder. So by understanding that, and by viewing even murderous pedophiles as with compassion. Yeah. And that's what we can do through the power of the written word.
And the healing that you bring to... Yes, and even posthumously, to your family. Yes, I mean, to those who've passed,
Yeah. And what's yours?
Well, and so intergenerational trauma clearly is where we intersect. Yes. So mine, it really started with the shock of my parents when I went back to Germany 6 months after, my husband had died, and we had the cyclone. I'd never had a close relationship with my mother, but it was one of those moments where you go, I need my mum. Yes. And so I went home, and I had not realized that my parents cannot deal with grief, and they were extremely judgmental of me still grieving 5 months or 6 months on. What? Shouldn't you be? I mean, really, come on.
Get over it.
Get over it. The self-pity, you really draw... I overheard my mother say it before. She's really pulling the widow card now to get sympathy. And I was obviously shocked. I was devastated. I didn't actually return home for a number of years, but it made me realize realized something. Somebody in Germany gave me a book, and it was about forgotten Germans, or rather, it was about the war children. So this book was written by a journalist who had reported on the children, the victims of the Balkan Wars. And then she went back home and said, what about my parents? They were victims of the Second World War, but nobody ever offered them counseling or even recognition of the trauma, because Germany was the perpetrator of the war. So then I started this investigation, and I realized that my parents' inability to be in any form sympathetic to my grief had to do with the fact that they had so much built up, pent up grief inside of them.
Yes.
That there had never been any healing. And when I gave that book to my parents, and my mother's answer is, well, we killed 6 million Jews. How can I see myself as a victim? And of course, her entire infancy from 0 to 8 was bombs, sheltering, losing relatives, coming back to a bombed out home. Every night they had a suitcase packed and going to the bunker. And my father's reaction is, I was 10 years old, I killed nobody. And so my father, and this is when I really realized this story needs to be told. Just recently we had a phone conversation, and he was watching the pictures coming out of the Ukraine, and he said, and I couldn't believe it, I was nearly crying. I saw my own story again, and he became a refugee at the age of 10. It was the coldest winter in Germany in I don't know how many years. It was minus 36 degrees, unimaginable. They didn't have padded ski jackets. They had, knitted woolen jumpers, 5 layers, and he was given a backpack, and all the family belongings were in that backpack. And then he was in charge of pushing his 5-year-old brother, and they marched 6 months through snow and ice, and sometimes they hitched a ride on open trains, and he watched babies freezing to death in these trains and having to be thrown into the fields. He watched his cousin being raped and so on. So that trauma is there, and I think that trauma and the resulting neurosis in my family have impacted me. I can see it so clearly now. So I think that's another book that needs to be written. How I'm going to tackle it, I'm not sure yet, but yes. I'm going back to Germany in September because, my parents are in their late 80s now, and I think I need to record the stories while they're there.
Yeah.
And hopefully that'll help my father and my mother to come to terms with the trauma that they've never acknowledged.
I think we're lucky that we're born into a generation where we're allowed to look at our stuff.
Yeah.
Because all of those generations, there weren't even pictures of the girl who was murdered. They weren't allowed to speak her name. So exactly. All of that, you just shoved your grief down, you buried it, and you moved on. Yeah. And that's very much the cultures that we came from.
Yeah.
But now we are free to do that. So if you feel that you need to tell your story, just start. Just pick up a pen today, get writing, write a bit, anything. Write from a photo, pick up an old photo. Think about that story that's on the top of your head that keeps coming back. Write it down.
Yeah.
And then write it again until it's out of your head and onto the page. Yeah.
Yes, and I sometimes say, thanks to Brené Brown, it's almost sexy now to be vulnerable, to explore your vulnerability, and that's a good thing, because we want those stories about vulnerability. We don't want the story of the person who just shoved their emotions down and didn't show it.
Yes, and you can reach and help other people with your stories.
Yes, so just start.
Yeah.
And if you want some more guidance, you can visit one of Edwina's retreats or workshops. So maybe tell us a little bit about your retreats or workshops.
So I run Relax and Write retreats, yoga and writing workshops for retreats for women. And non-binary people are very welcome too. And I do heavily craft-based ones, but I have one on life writing coming up at Marucci River in October 14th to 16th. It's my daughter's birthday, the 14th. So I should remember. So 14th to 16th is the life writing one. So it's Relax and Write retreats, and you'll find all the info on my website, edwinashaw.com, or Relax and Write retreats. Yes.
Yes,
And
mine,
yours.
well, I called my business Write Your Journey because I've realized that writing is also a way to shape my journey, or rather my tagline is you're the author of your own life. So you can change, you can tell, it's all up to how you tell yourself the story, because that is one of the things I realized looking at my parents, that my mother has told herself the story in a certain way, and that's really kept her closed. And so write your journey, you're the author of your own life. And I hold retreats at the moment here in Far North Queensland, Mission Beach. We have them when it's not raining, when we don't have cyclone season. So I just had one in June, the next one is in July, August. We have them frequently throughout the year. We do 4 nights, fully catered, so people don't have to worry about, should I eat this, should I go there today? No, I just want everybody working on their stories. We combine it with yoga and sound healing, in fact, and we also take our participants through World Heritage listed rainforest on guided walks, because it's also about developing that beginner's mind, looking at everything through fresh eyes, including your own story. And I also have my retreat. I will resume my retreats now that the borders are open again in Vietnam. So the first one is March 2023.
Oh, great.
Yes. And so my website is www.writeyourjourney.com. Yeah. And you can subscribe to our newsletters, because I know Edwina sends out great, and I find your blogs always very helpful, and writing prompts, and I do the same. So.
Yes, they're lovely as well. So we love each other. Right.
That was another silver lining of the pandemic. So there we go.
Yes. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Writing with Kerstin and Edwina.
And here are our links. Please follow us and leave comments. Happy writing. That's good.